Good morning, everyone. Welcome all of you joining the public presentation organized by the Occupational Health Center. Today's the topic is about human rights and the COVID-19 vaccines policies in the workplace, and presented by Karen Sharma, the Acting Executive Director of the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. We would like to begin that by acknowledging that we are on the Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Greek, OG Greek, Dakotas, and Diné peoples, and the homelands of Métis nations. We respect the treaties that we were made on these territories, and we acknowledge we are all treaty people. At the Occupational Health Center, we commit ourselves to a process of reconciliation with Indigenous communities. For the audience participation and follow-up, so would you please put your question in the chat box section on the right side of your screen. The presenter will try to answer it afterwards. So we're going to have about 15-20 minutes for the Q&A session. Since we have more than 450 people registered for this webinar, we may be apologize, we may be not able to answer all the questions during the Q&A. Would you please connect with us after that to follow up? That would be really appreciated. This session is being recorded and then for viewing after and share on the social media. And also please participate in the follow-up evaluation survey, giving us the feedback for upcoming events. Now this is the time, please join me to welcome Karen Sharma.
Good morning, everyone. Then to share my screen and start the presentation.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you today to talk about what I think is a very timely and important issue, the issue of how to balance human rights obligations with the need to protect the safety of our communities and deal with COVID-19 vaccine requirements. So I'm just going to share my screen here. I have a PowerPoint presentation today, and Tiffany has kindly agreed to circulate a copy of this PowerPoint. I temporarily lost. Okay, Tiffany, can you confirm that my screen is visible?
It's really good.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to get started. So the purpose of today's session is to discuss the human rights implications of COVID-19 vaccine requirements. And throughout today's session, I'm going to be referencing a recently released guideline that the Commission has issued called COVID-19 vaccine requirements and human rights. And I'll share the link with you so that you have a copy of this. But know that if you want additional detail related to this topic, that guideline is a great place to start. And you can always contact the Commission as well if you have additional questions beyond those that are addressed in the guideline. About who we Commission is an independent agency of the government of Manitoba. So we have sort of an arm's length relationship to government. And our job is to administer a law in Manitoba called the Human Rights. The purpose of the Human Rights Code is really to ensure that all Manitobans, irrespective of their race, gender, religious belief, etc., and I'll talk to you more about that in a minute, are entitled to be treated equally, really. So the intent identity that they can't easily change, and that people have throughout history experience. It's really all about protecting the principle of equality and ensuring that equality lives throughout all areas of, including, in the context of our jobs, when we're receiving public services, in housing. What some of our constitutional rights, including those apologies, folks, I'm having some internet connectivity issues, so I'm going to turn my video off in the hopes that that helps with things, but you should still hopefully hear my voice without too much of a lag. I thought maybe I should take this call from home, because sometimes the internet connection is a bit better at home. And of course, I should have probably listened to my better instincts. So, on the audio, and you're able to see my slides. So as I mentioned, the Human Rights Code is all about enshrining this idea that we ought not to experience discrimination. So we should be treated equally in all areas of society. And in order to ensure that that principle is adhered to and enforced, the Human Rights Code sets out a process for individuals to make complaints to our commission. And that's one of our principal jobs, is to take those complaints, figure out whether we think there's enough evidence that those complaints should go to hearing. And we also work hard to try to avoid the hearing process by resolving issues through mediation. So one of our jobs is, of course, in complaints administration, but we also work to promote human rights principles in Manitoba through policy, research, and education initiatives. And you'll see sometimes that we release guidelines, policy documents, statements, really in an effort to ensure that human rights are alive and well in the province of Manitoba. So as I mentioned, the law that we have the responsibility of, it prohibits individuals from experiencing discrimination, which within the law is defined as treating a person differently on the basis of what we call protected characteristics. And I'll go through that list in just a moment. But in effect, treating someone adversely, negatively, or differently without really having a reasonable justification for doing so. So without reasonable cause for that treatment. And so that's sort of a basic way of firing someone from a job for a disability-related reason. It could mean racial profiling in stores, which sometimes we get complaints about. So any kind of adverse or negative treatment, that a protected characteristic, and where there really is not a good justification for doing. The way that discrimination is defined within our law is when you fail to reasonably accommodate the needs of a person, where those needs are based on a protected characteristic or relate to a protected characteristic. So really that means, failing to remove the barrier to equality that might prevent someone from participating on a level playing field.
Okay, so we're going to try a slightly different strategy here. I've asked Tiffany to project the slides, so I'll just ask you to advance slides when the time comes. And I've connected in through my phone in the hopes that that's a more reliable internet connection. So thank you so much for being patient with us here. You know, Zoom is great because it allows so much more connection between us, but the downside is technical difficulties, right? So Tiffany, I'm wondering if you can advance to slide 3. Wonderful. Okay, perfect. Yeah, you can leave it there. So I mentioned that, and I hope you heard that the role of the commission is to ensure that Manitobans do not experience unreasonable discrimination in the context of their work, in receiving public services, in housing, etc. And the way in which the law defines discrimination is when we treat a person differently on the basis of a protected characteristic, and I'll tell you what those protected characteristics are in a moment, without having a good justification for doing so or a reasonable basis for that kind of treatment. And the law also defines discrimination as failing to reasonably accommodate the needs of a person. So when we don't remove barriers to equality, where those needs relate to a protected characteristic. So I had mentioned, you know, if you can't work in an office building, maybe there was a push button at the front door of your office building. Maybe you took an elevator up, maybe you noticed that the doorways of your office were widened. All of those are examples of ways in which we're reasonably accommodating or ensuring access for persons with disabilities. So reasonable accommodation is all around us at all times. It's about this idea that we have to, you know, sometimes meet the needs of people to ensure that they can equitably participate in society. And finally, the code also prohibits harassment where it's connected to a protected characteristic and reprisal. Now, the one thing I was mentioning just as I lost you folks in the last go around was that you'll notice in the definition of discrimination that there's this idea that the kind of discrimination that's prohibited is discrimination where there is no justifiable or reasonable cause for the conduct. And really what that is enshrining in the law is an understanding that there may be circumstances where treating a person differently for reasons related to a protected characteristic or, you know, failing to accommodate a person may be permissible and allowable. And it all relates back to this idea that our rights under, you know, human rights legislation in the charter are not absolute. And there's this, you know, understanding that there may be circumstances in which discrimination, inequality, unfortunately, may be permissible or allowable or legitimate, but these are very narrow and limited circumstances, and they have to be justifiable. And there's principles that have emerged through case law that set out how you determine whether discrimination in certain circumstances is allowable or justifiable, because what we really want to ensure is that we're protecting people from experiencing unreasonable, unjustifiable treatment, prejudice, stereotyping, and inequality. Okay, Tiffany, you can advance to the next slide. So I mentioned that the Human Rights Code protects people from experiencing discrimination on the basis of things we call protected characteristics. Now, these are things that are specifically listed in our law, and they're often things that go to the core of a person's sort of identity, who they are as individuals. They're not things that people can easily change about themselves. And they're often things people have experienced historical prejudice, stereotyping, and negative treatment on the basis of in past. So there are things like race and ancestry, national origin or ethnic background, religious belief, physical or mental disability, mental health condition, I should say, sex, sexual orientation, etc. So often things that are integral to who we are as individuals. And if discrimination relates or, negative treatment relates to something outside of this list, it might be considered under human rights law, but it has to pass a bit of a test to determine that it is one of these things that's integral to our identity and who we are as people. Okay, advance to the next slide. So the Human Rights Code applies in most areas of our daily life, including employment, services that are available to the public, and that can include coming to a government office for access to benefits, or it can include going to a restaurant, a hotel. Any service that's readily available to the public has to ensure it's being provided in a manner that's compliant with human rights legislation. Housing, that can include the rental or purchase of property, so it's a pretty broad definition. Contracts, so you can't enter into discriminatory contracts in Manitoba. And then finally, there's a provision in our code that says you can't display in public places like this discriminatory signs or statements. So next slide. Okay, now let's get to the good stuff, the reason we're all here today, which is to talk about the interaction between human rights and COVID-19 vaccines. So first, I want to set a little bit of the context for you around what we've learned about COVID-19 and human rights generally. So when the COVID-19 pandemic first emerged in Manitoba, in approximately March of 2020, the Commission, like many human rights organizations across Canada, was, pretty concerned that this illness and the kind of corollary impacts of it would have significant implications for human rights in Manitoba. And so one of the first things that we did was to release a framework that contained principles and actions for governments, service providers, housing providers, employers, et cetera, on how to ensure that they were approaching the COVID-19 pandemic in a way that centered human rights principles. And, one of the reasons we were nervous about human rights, being enforced throughout this pandemic is that we know that in moments of crisis, often those instances have a disproportionate and negative impact on people who experience structural inequities or historically have experienced disadvantage. And, looking back now, we're about 18, 19 months into this pandemic, I think those concerns were certainly borne out. If we look at the data, we see that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on code-protected groups like older Manitobans, Indigenous, Black, and people of color who we're seeing have experienced disproportionate rates of COVID-19 and severe outcomes related to COVID-19. People who reside in congregate living facilities, which include people who are incarcerated, individuals in personal care homes, et cetera, unemployed people or people who have precarious employment. And we're seeing, that people on our front lines who are doing essential work have really borne the brunt of this pandemic. And we're also we've experienced and monitored that the impacts of restrictive and protective measures also have a significant impact on code protected groups or people who've experienced historical or structural inequities. And that includes women and caregivers who, had to rise to the occasion and balance work with educating children, doing additional caregiving responsibilities. It had a significant impact during school closures. We're also seeing the impact on people with disabilities, in particular when it comes to access to a number of services, right? So the COVID-19 pandemic has not been felt equally throughout our communities, and it mostly has a sort of most significant impact on people who experience structural inequities. And finally, I've missed this bullet, but we've been talking a lot about not solely experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic, but also recognizing the shadow pandemics that have come with the COVID-19 pandemic, which includes the rise in family violence, intimate partner violence, and the challenges with tainted drug supply and access to safe supply and services for people who use drugs, and the rapid increase in deaths related to overdose has been a significant symptom of that. So you can advance to the next slide. So again, what does this tell us? COVID-19 is not felt by everybody in the same way, and it has the most significant impact on communities that are structurally disadvantaged or experience structural inequities. And again, you can advance. I should just mention before you advance, sorry, Tiffany, that I've got a few resources on the side there, including that principles and framework document that I mentioned, but also a couple of documents that you may be familiar with, including the data that's been released periodically by the government of Manitoba on race, ethnicity, and Indigenous identifiers in COVID-19, and the First Nations pandemic groups regular reporting on First Nations indicators in COVID-19, both of which demonstrate these disproportionate impacts. Okay, now you can advance. Thank you. In terms of the question, Renee, yes, I believe they're located on the Manitoba government website, but I'll include the link in the resources that I send to Tiffany so that you have the access to that. Thanks for that. Okay, so what do we know? That we know that communities that experience structural inequity are at disproportionate risk for COVID-19. And one of the things we also have observed is that vaccines play a critical role in protecting the health and well-being of these communities, of our communities generally, but in particular communities that have experienced those disproportionate impacts, right? So on the one hand, COVID-19 vaccines and growing vaccination rates help ensure people can experience equality because they lessen those disproportionate impacts. So, one way of looking at COVID-19 vaccines is that they are a safeguard in terms of human rights, particularly for our most disadvantaged in our communities. Next slide, please. And we know that because of that important safeguard that they offer, that many organizations have been looking to implement COVID-19 vaccine policies and requirements within their organizations as a way of really protecting the health of their employees, maybe their participants and clients, maybe their patients and residents. So we've seen this, great increase in uptake of mandatory vaccination policies or proof of vaccine policies. And we've also seen governments, in particular in the last month or so, the government of Manitoba mandating as part of our public health orders, so as part of the law, mandating proof of vaccine requirements for some occupations, sectors, and settings. So I am technically an employee of the Department of Justice, and we're one area that has been identified as, an area in which there ought to be COVID-19 vaccine requirements, particularly for those working with vulnerable Manitobans. We're seeing, vaccine requirements in indoor dining, in healthcare occupations, et cetera, in educational settings. So we've seen that mandate also effected through the law as well. And you can advance to the next slide. Now, while COVID-19 vaccines are certainly critical to safeguarding human rights, and we've seen that, right? We've seen the disproportionate impact on communities, and then the sort of attendant, the decreased rates of transmission. So we see that safeguard that it offers to communities. It's important to remember that some people can't be vaccinated for reasons related to a code protected ground. So there are some people who may experience, challenges in being able to be vaccinated for, and I'll talk you through this in more detail, but we know that there are some people who cannot be vaccinated. And then there are individuals who also experience barriers in accessing the vaccine, particularly, for our most marginalized or for reasons related to structural inequities. And I'll talk you through that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So we're at this kind of juncture, right, where we're having to figure out how to uphold individual rights, in particular, the rights of people who maybe can't be vaccinated for reasons related to a code protected ground, while also acting collectively to keep each other safe. And that's been a challenge throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. How do we strike that careful balance between individual and collective rights? Because that is one of the things that our protective and restrictive measures have really required us to do. So you can advance to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the Human Rights Code protects people from experiencing discrimination, so negative treatment for reasons related to a code protected ground. So going back to that list, things like ancestry, race, religious belief, etc. And, as I mentioned, there may be people who cannot be vaccinated for reasons related to one of these code protected grounds. So there are circumstances in which requiring proof of vaccine may give rise to discrimination. And if you advance to the next slide, I can give you a few examples here. So some examples of what that could look like are, people who have medical conditions or disabilities that limit their ability to be vaccinated. Obviously, people currently under the age of 12, although that's an evolving number, right? But certainly on the basis of age, some people may not be able to access vaccine. We know that migrant and undocumented people who may lack coverage for Manitoba Health may not realize that they have options for accessing the vaccine, or vaccine access hasn't been, considered for in accessible ways for those communities, or they may be fearful of presenting at a healthcare provider for fear that it might reveal their immigration status. So there's barriers there as well. We've also heard that people with certain religious beliefs or political beliefs may also, for reasons related to those beliefs, not be able to be vaccinated. So certainly some interaction between code protected grounds and reasons for why people can't be vaccinated. And Erin, I see your question in the chat about elaborating on religious beliefs, and I'll do that in the Q&A period if that's okay, and come back to that. Yeah, I see the questions popping up on religious beliefs, and certainly that's a hot topic for us right now. So I'll elaborate that on that during the Q&A period, most certainly. So generally, COVID-19 vaccines can interact with a code protected ground, and it may give rise to discrimination for if someone can't be vaccinated for reasons related to a code protected ground. If you can advance to the next slide. Now, the thing to remember, though, is that the Human Rights Code protects against unreasonable or illegitimate or unjustifiable discrimination. And while we know that COVID-19 vaccine requirements could result in differential treatment for some communities who cannot be vaccinated for reasons related to one of those protected characteristics, we also recognize that there may be circumstances where implementing a mandatory vaccine policy is legitimate and necessary. So in other words, defensible under human rights law. But what we would say is it's only legitimate and necessary and defensible if less intrusive means of preventing COVID-19 are, inadequate for the setting, and only where due consideration has been given to the human rights of everyone involved. And this really requires a case-by-case analysis and assessment of whether it's justifiable to implement a mandatory vaccine requirement in those specific circumstances. And I'll go through some of the factors that you need to consider as part of that assessment in just a moment. So if you advance to the next slide. One important thing to remember is that personal choice or preference not to be vaccinated is, especially where that personal preference may be based on misinformation or misunderstandings of scientific information. It's the Commission's position that this is not grounds for a human rights complaint under the code. So an organization who implements a mandatory vaccination policy and, an individual says, well, I really am uncomfortable with vaccines, or I just don't want to be vaccinated right now, or I don't believe in vaccines for, XYZ reason, that isn't the basis for saying your human rights have been violated. In other words, personal choice or preference is not a protected characteristic under the code. And it can't be argued that you've been discriminated against because you have, decided not to be vaccinated. And that is central, a central distinction in this conversation, because there certainly have been a number of people who've presented at the Commission, and we've seen a few cases through human rights tribunals over the last few months where the individual in question is saying that for reasons, for discomfort, for not believing in vaccines, someone does not want to be vaccinated. And I think coming back to that list and remembering what human rights law is all about. Human rights law is about ensuring people who've historically experienced disadvantage or prejudice, who've been discriminated against throughout the ages. Oh, sorry about that. Do not experience that kind of negative treatment. So in that respect, it isn't about individual choice and preference. We've seen, as I mentioned, a couple of tribunal decisions that have really reinforced this position. One from the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, and most of them have actually dealt with face coverings and masks. So one from the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, where an individual did not want to wear a mask because he really didn't believe that a mask was effective in controlling the transmission or spread of COVID-19. And the tribunal was very clear there, this is, that's a personal choice issue and it doesn't entitle you to human rights protection. Similarly, a decision along those lines from the BC Human Rights Tribunal as well. So that's I think this is a pretty well confirmed principle, personal choice preference, not a protected characteristic, not something that entitles you to human rights protection. Now, what I will say though is that implementation of COVID-19 vaccine requirements are an extremely intrusive method of controlling the transmission of COVID-19. And what I mean by that is that, on the spectrum of things that we can do to control COVID-19 in our workplaces and in public services and housing, it's pretty much at the, more extreme end of the spectrum in that it requires someone to undergo a medical treatment, et cetera. If we think masks, PPE, physical distancing is probably on the other end of that spectrum, right? So I think it is important that that we recognize that some people may have discomfort and some people may be fearful, may require more information, may require more support in order to make those decisions, and try our best to, prevent any kind of divisiveness or negative negativity to emerge in relation to this, which I think is fair to say we've seen a rise in communities, right? A sort of us versus them mentality around this. And I don't think that is at all in the spirit of what the code is attempting to achieve, even if this may not be technically a human rights issue. Okay, so over to the next slide. Now let's talk about, so let's say you've determined or you believe that you may require COVID-19 vaccination requirements in your workplace or in in delivering public services, housing, etc. And you've determined that you believe you require a mandatory vaccination policy. So what are some things that you need to think about to ensure that that policy is legitimate, justifiable, defensible under human rights law? So here are some basic principles that we think are important for organizations to consider. First, and all of these principles are elaborated in some detail in our guidelines. So if you want to really get into the nuts and bolts of each of these, take a look at our guideline. I'll make sure that that link is in the email I send around after today's session, so you can delve in a little bit deeper. But so what are some of these principles? So first, ensuring you deal with issues of equitable access. So when I started talking about vaccines, I mentioned that some people can't be vaccinated for reasons related to a code-protected ground. And then we have the challenge also that marginalized, structurally disadvantaged communities have also just experienced challenges in accessing vaccine for a number of reasons, right? So have, maybe experienced challenges in being able to access a vaccine in the language that they understand and make informed choices, because there's a lack of interpretation services available. Maybe, again, they're someone who lacks Manitoba health coverage and so are fearful about presenting at a vaccination site and, not having access to health coverage. Maybe we also know that this is a challenge for people who experience houselessness and may not have photo identification, fixed address, etc. So all of these may give rise to challenges of access and equity that we would strongly encourage organizations to think of when they're adopting policies. So it might mean, because we know that not everybody can equitably access a vaccine, you've got to give some thought to that when you're adopting these kinds of policies. How are you going to bridge some of those barriers? If you're adopting this kind of policy for staff, it might mean ensuring you provide time off for access of a COVID-19 vaccine. And in fact, I believe there were some amendments to the Employment Standards Code to deal with those kinds of issues, right? So ensuring you can give people time off, give people support, provide information where necessary, ensure those important equity considerations are addressed when implementing the policy. So first, think about equitable access. The second principle that we believe is really important in ensuring that should you believe you need to adopt this type of policy in your workplace. So the second principle we would say is important is ensuring that the policy is evidence-based. So if you are adopting this kind of policy, it should be because there's significant evidence that of increased risk in the context in which you're thinking of adopting the policy. So let's say you are a restaurant. Obviously, public health has deemed that to be a site of risk because we see that they've adopted mandatory vaccination in those kind of contexts. So you want to make sure that there's evidence that this policy is reasonably necessary based on the context occupation in which it's being implemented. If you are an employer and 90% of your employees are working from home, have very limited contact with the public, etc., adopting a mandatory vaccination policy in that case may not be, substantiated by evidence, right? Because you really want to make sure that you've got that evidentiary base for adopting whatever policy you do. So that's the first principle, or second principle we would strongly recommend, is making sure that that your policies are evidence-based, and where the evidence changes. So let's say community transmission related to COVID-19 decreases, we're in a state where things are pretty well under control, then it may not be necessary anymore to have this kind of policy in place. So make sure it's on the basis of good medical and epidemiological understandings of the risks relevant to COVID-19. So the next principle is that it be time limited. And what we mean by this is that you don't want to say, hey, for here on ever after, we're going to require that COVID-19 vaccines be mandatory in the workplace. Again, unless there's some epidemiological evidence that suggests that's necessary, or public health evidence that suggests that that's maybe necessary. But really, your policies should be reviewed and updated to match the most current conditions of COVID-19 and reflect up-to-date public health guidance. So one thing I'll say is that the COVID-19 pandemic is somewhat of an unknown, right? We don't know when we're going to be out of this thing. We're seeing variants of concern, et cetera. So it may not be possible to put a fixed end date, but I would suggest that you regularly review your policy and put in clear periods of review within the policy itself, so that you ensure that the policy reflects current public health guidance. So make sure it's time limited in that sense. Next, you want to make sure that your policy is proportional. And what we mean is that, again, the policy has to be sort of linked to or proportional to the health and safety risks that it seeks to address. As more people are vaccinated and risk decreases, maybe you should relax your rules. Or if the nature of the work being performed isn't as risky, it may not be appropriate for that particular occupation or setting. So because this is a fairly intrusive thing requiring someone be vaccinated or undergo a medical treatment, you want to make sure that you're only implementing it where less intrusive methods have been considered and are inadequate, and where it's absolutely necessary and proportional to the risks present in that context or setting. So proportional. Next, we want to make sure that it's absolutely necessary. So again, all of these kinds of principles of evidence-based, proportional, necessary are all linked, but in essence that you've thought about all other possible alternatives, and they're again inadequate based on the nature of the setting, the service being delivered, or occupation being performed. And finally, you want to give consideration to the privacy rights of everyone involved. So vaccination status information is personal health information. You want to make it really clear to people why you're collecting it, how you're using it, storing it in a responsible way that is accords with your obligations under applicable privacy law. And in our guideline, we link to a joint statement from federal, provincial, and territorial privacy commissioners that will be really helpful for you to review around how you're storing and considering this kind of data. So next slide, please. So you want to think about all those principles when creating this kind of policy to ensure that it's legitimate and defensible under human rights law. But you should also consider that people who can't be vaccinated for reasons related to a code-protected ground must be reasonably accommodated to the point of undue hardship. So you've got to make sure that if someone presents to you and says, I can't be vaccinated for reasons related to a disability, et cetera, that you're thinking about reasonably accommodating their needs. again, up to that point of undue hardship. So you are balancing that against the attendant safety and health risks. So some possible, if you could advance to the next slide. That's in here. Yeah, some possible forms of what reasonable accommodation could look like is it might include an exemption for employees from mandatory vaccination policies if they have a legitimate code protected reason for not being vaccinated. It could mean enhancing personal protective equipment for employees who can't be vaccinated for reasons, again, maybe related to a disability, a religious belief, etc. It might mean periodic and regular COVID-19 testing. And if you take a look at the current public health order, that certainly is the accommodation or alternative that's contemplated there in those particular settings is that idea of regular periodic testing. It might mean modified shifts, duties, increasing physical distance between employees. If you're a service provider, it could look like offering an alternative form of service like virtual or curbside service delivery. So you have to think about these possible forms of providing accommodation, and your obligations are, of course, to provide reasonable accommodation and up into that point of undue hardship. So an undue hardship can look like a health and safety risk. So if it's not going to be safe for that employee to perform their duties unvaccinated, maybe because they're working directly with the public, maybe because they are healthcare providers providing a direct service to the public, it may be necessary for you to think of some alternatives. And obviously, based on what's in the current public health order, regular and periodic testing is considered one form of certainly, allowable or legitimate alternative because it still maintains that protection of public health. So next slide, please. So in summary, and I am really looking forward to taking a few questions. I know that we got off to a bit of a rocky start, so I can stay on a few minutes extra if that helps folks so that we can address the many questions that have been sort of buzzing in the chat. But in summary, it's really important that we put human rights at the center of our COVID-19 risk mitigation strategies. You've got to make sure that when you're implementing when you're implementing public health measures, that you do so in a way that reflects the best medical and scientific evidence relevant to that applicable setting. You've got to think about less intrusive methods for preventing COVID-19 transmission. You got to explore them before implementing this kind of policy because it can give rise to discrimination. And next slide. And what I've shared today, so we know that vaccines are important to protecting communities against COVID-19 because of we've seen the disproportionate impact on communities that are structurally disadvantaged or experience structural inequities. Notwithstanding this, it can give rise to discrimination on the basis of a code protected ground. I emphasize that personal choice preference is not a code protected ground. And next slide. So where these policies are necessary, you've got to think about the needs of those who can't be vaccinated for reasons related to a code protected ground and reasonably accommodate those needs to that point of undue hardship. And you've got to think about the principles of equitable access, ensure these policies are evidence-based, time-limited, proportional to the health and safety risks they seek to address, that they're absolutely necessary, and consider the privacy rights of the people impacted. And considering these factors is important to ensuring that vaccine policies are defensible under human rights law. So next slide just has some additional resources that we've got here, but check out our guideline on human rights and COVID-19 vaccine requirements. We've got a fact sheet also on on human rights and COVID-19 that has some question and answers, including question and answers related to religious belief, etc. So please do take a look at those resources, and let's turn it over to questions, because I see that there's quite a few coming through. So maybe I'll ask for your help, Tiffany and Carmen, in getting to the question period here.
We do have several questions. So we've kind of amalgamated some, because as you've noticed, there's lots of questions on similar topics. So we'll just kind of go down the list and in that order. Can you elaborate on the religious beliefs that may provide exemptions?
So to our knowledge, at this point, we are not aware of any major religions that specify requirements against vaccination. Notwithstanding that, there may be circumstances where a person has a religious belief that connects to a reason for why they can't be vaccinated. So we're saying we're not aware of any religious requirements related to this, but it's not outside of the realm of possibility, right? So there haven't been any cases to date from human rights tribunals. I actually haven't had a chance to look at labor arbitration decisions, but certainly in the human rights realm, we haven't seen any decisions yet that have taken a look at this specific issue of COVID-19 vaccine requirements and religious belief. However, there are other human rights decisions that are helpful in navigating this issue. And here I think of Supreme Court of Canada decisions like the Amsalem decision, and I can link to this if it would be helpful, but who wants to read it, for the 40-page Supreme Court of Canada decision. But there are decisions like that talk about how employers, service providers, housing providers should approach the sort of reasonable accommodation of religious beliefs. And that guidance tells us that, generally employers, service providers should stay out of being an arbitrator or determining what is legitimate and not illegitimate when it comes to a religious belief. And what we should be focused on instead is taking those beliefs as freely and sincerely held. And so if someone comes to you and says, I have this belief, your focus is on, is this a sincere belief? Is it integrally linked to that person's faith system? And is there sort of a genuine connection or infringement on them as it relates to that religious belief? So, the courts have told us, stay out of requiring letters from pastors or priests, or getting people to show you where exactly in doctrine it says that they can't be vaccinated. Because generally, if you think back, especially in the historical sense, it's never proved well when governments, et cetera, have gotten involved too much in determining what's legitimate in the religious realm. So we like to keep certain spheres separate for good reason, right? So take those beliefs as freely and sincerely held. Show how people have an obligation to show you, though, how it's integrally linked by articulating, this is my belief, this is why it's connected to my faith system, et cetera. And then our obligation, again, is to consider reasonable accommodation to that point of undue hardship. So it could look like many of the types of accommodation that were listed on that earlier slide, like regular periodic testing, increased PPE, alternate duties, modified shift schedules, virtual or curbside service delivery options. So you'll think about reasonable accommodation up to that point of undue hardship.
Thanks, Karen. There was also related questions around political beliefs. So I don't know if that is covered essentially by the same answer, but some questions around being a member of a specific political party, if that political party takes the stance of against vaccinations. Are you able to speak to that a little bit?
Yep, for sure. So the issue of political belief has somewhat been commented on by tribunals. The British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal issued a decision a few weeks ago that provided a bit of commentary on that connection between a political belief and the inability to be vaccinated. And their commentary in that particular case was, although it wasn't made out by the facts that had been presented by that by the complainant, the tribunal noted that certainly, again, it's not outside of the realm of possibility that a person has a political belief that prevents them from being vaccinated. Notwithstanding that, and this is an important caveat from the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal, even if you have a political belief that may limit your ability to be vaccinated, you're still obligated to follow the law. So if the law requires you to wear masks in indoor settings, if the law requires you to be vaccinated to access certain kinds of sites, you aren't entitled to say, I'm exempt from following the law. You may be entitled to certain forms of reasonable accommodation. They probably still have to be within that law. So if there's a mandate through the public health order that specifies vaccination in certain contexts, probably still obligated to follow that. Although I note that the public health order, certainly in the occupational area, provides for alternatives like regular and periodic testing. So all that to say, we've got a little bit more commentary from tribunals on the issue of political belief. It's fairly similar to religious belief, which is to say there certainly could be a political belief that isn't outside of the realm of possibility that connects to a reason why a person cannot be vaccinated. Your approach is quite similar. So is this a belief that a person has that's sort of linked to their understanding of the political functioning of society? And I should note that courts in the past have said discrete or singular beliefs about an issue are not enough to rise to the level of being a political belief entitled to human rights protection. So let's just say it's not about like your political orientation to the world, but you just don't believe in vaccines. That's probably not going to be enough to be a political belief. It would have to be, and I use this as an example without any attribution of this being an actual political belief, but let's say I was part of like the just the koala, political orientation system, and my orientation system is that we don't believe in any government in intrusion in our lives, and so we don't believe in any form of medical intervention. Let's say it's something like that. So not outside of the realm of possibility. Again, it has to be broader than a singular belief or idea. It has to be about your political understanding of sort of the political and social organization of society. And you take it sort of as freely and sincerely held. So it's going to be difficult to ask someone to substantiate that, maybe through documentary evidence, but again, we want to kind of get out of being a moderator of what is legitimate and illegitimate in that regard as well.
What if someone is receiving harassment due to the personal choice preference piece, as an example, stating, being in the vicinity of a fellow staff member stating that unvaccinated staff should be fired? Does that meet the criteria for discrimination?
It probably does not meet the criteria for discrimination under the Human Rights Code, but you have other legal obligations as well related to respectful work environments that you should be mindful of in that regard. And I will just say that while it might not be harassment or discrimination under the Human Rights Code, it's just the kind of conduct we want to avoid having happen in the context of our workplaces, right? Like, I think we've got to understand that the kinds of things that people are being asked to do and steps that we're collectively being asked to take to keep ourselves healthy and safe in this time are unprecedented. We haven't been asked to do these kinds of things on this massive of a scale before. And so we really need to approach each other with empathy and patience and an understanding that this is going to take some time for some people to to figure out how they feel about, to do the science, to understand the science, I should say, consult with the appropriate folks who have that knowledge base. So I think the approach we should all take in our collective organizations, in the spirit of both human rights and respectful workplace, is to encourage empathy and understanding, and to take, to really tamper down that vitriol and divisiveness that's emerging in relation to this issue.
And as somebody points out in the chat, it could be considered bullying or harassment under workplace health and safety regulations, separate and aside from human rights law.
That's exactly it, right? Like under workplace safety and health, you have obligations around having respectful workplace policies, around having anti-harassment policies, which are slightly broader in scope than what we're dealing with here, which is harassment related to a protected characteristic. So it rises to that level of being an equality issue, connected to our identity, who we are as people, what people have experienced historical disadvantage of on the basis of in past. But there are still other legal obligations you have. That's exactly right.
Is medical freedom and medical privacy a human right?
Oh, that's, so I've covered with you the way in which discrimination is defined in under the Human Rights Code. And what I'd say is, just your right to make medical choices, about what kind of treatment you're going to receive or not, probably falls into that territory of being personal choice or preference. So I'm not sure that is necessarily a discrimination or equality issue. Notwithstanding that, I totally get that people have fear. They want to be able to have agency and choice. They want to be able to make informed choices. And we've got to find ways of respecting and enabling that in our communities, especially for communities that have experienced historical disadvantage at the hands and inequity at the hands of our healthcare systems. It is fully, I completely appreciate and understand why there might be a reluctance or fear or, just some consideration given to whether that sort of trust and willingness to partake in a vaccine. So we've got to approach the issue with empathy and understanding and increase the resources that people have and supports that they have to make informed choice. But might not be a discrimination issue because it might fall into the realm of personal choice and preference, as it relates to your ability to file a complaint under the Human Rights Code. That's not to say that it isn't just an important pressing issue kind of just generally in our communities. And then on that question of privacy, people do have privacy rights under applicable privacy legislation. And I think it's important that any organization that's collecting vaccine information from people understand and uphold their privacy obligations under whatever privacy legislation they fall under, whether it's federal or provincial. So knowing and understanding how you're using, collecting, and storing that data, understanding that you should be using it on a need-to-know basis only, and being really clear with people about how the data is being used, disclosed, and stored is vital to ensure that you're upholding those legal requirements.
And somewhat related on the topic of privacy from a human rights perspective, what is the best way for an organization to be gathering that proof of vaccination if they are in an industry that falls under that public health order? Yeah,
so the public health order specifies what is proof, etc. So you want to be mindful of that. But one thing I would say from a human rights perspective is that be mindful that not everyone is going to be able to have equitable access to the immunization card. There were some real challenges for people who don't have Manitoba health coverage, which could include people who are here as international students, as temporary workers, as people who don't have immigration status or documentation. That could include people who have experience homelessness or other forms of structural disadvantage that challenge their ability to get photo identification, et cetera. So be really mindful of the fact that there are barriers in getting access to that immunization card, and try to be, supportive and accommodating in the kinds of forms of proof that you're willing to accept. Also recognize that where you're requiring proof of photo identification alongside the card, that could present barriers for some people, especially if you're providing a service to the public. That could obviously produce some barriers for individuals who have challenges accessing photo identification. And we know that communities that experience poverty and homelessness, that's a major challenge getting access to photo ID, right? So recognize that there are those barriers and think about that in terms of what kind of proof you're willing to accept. And again, when it comes to the immunization card, people who are vaccinated outside of Manitoba also going to have trouble getting access to photo ID. So remember that as well. In terms of other considerations, you just want to make sure, my suggestion would be look at the guidance that was provided by federal, provincial, territorial privacy commissioners around collection, use, and storage of that data. And remember that it's personal health information. So if you are, think about it as that kind of data and store it accordingly in the way that you would other health information that you might collect or store from employees.
A couple questions on this. If employers are using frequent COVID testing as an accommodation measure for those who are not vaccinated, who would the employee ever be in the position where they're required to pay for that testing?
Okay, so where an employer requires testing as part of an accommodation, was that sorry?
Yeah, so if an employer requires either vaccination or frequent testing, who pays for that? Whose responsibility is that?
Ooh, yeah, so that's a tricky question. I don't know that I have a definitive answer from a human rights perspective on that question. And in comparable scenarios, like where you've had drug and alcohol testing in the workplace or other kinds of testing, the cost has historically been borne by the employer, where testing is an occupational requirement. However, there are some kind of fuzzy areas, which is to say, particularly for people who maybe are choosing not to be vaccinated and going the testing route, whether the cost should be borne by the employer or the individual, that's a bit unclear. So I think that's one that we don't have guidance on from, labor arbitrators or tribunals as yet. So I'm reluctant to answer it. But if you are setting this up as an accommodation obligation, think about generally when you're providing other kinds of equipment or accommodations in that context, that's usually something that's borne by the employer, right? The cost of accommodation. So I'd say use those other principles that you have in accommodation scenarios and apply them to this context as well.
Back to the privacy side of things, what is the employer's responsibility for privacy protection of their employees when dealing with third-party requirements such as external clients requiring proof of vaccination for employees to perform, work at their site?
Yeah, so in other words, you maybe are a contractor and you're having to go into a personal care home that has a requirement related to vaccination status. Is that sort of the scenario that's contemplated there?
Yeah, I think that's a good example.
Yeah, so I think if that is a requirement of a third party that you provide service to, sorry about that, getting other calls. So if you have that requirement, or it's a requirement of a party that you provide service to or that you do work for, then just like in other contexts, like let's say you have other kinds of safety and health restrictions, like let's say you are required to have steel toe boots to enter that work site, or you know, maybe certain kinds of security clearance to work in certain areas. I'd think of it as a requirement kind of akin to that. So you want to obviously comply. If an employee can't or is not able to, I'd say go the supportive route first, which is maybe see about assigning them to different or alternate work duties, or you know, trying to find different a different placement for that person for the you know, for that duration, et cetera, so that you can minimize the negative impacts on those individuals. So I would look at those kinds of approaches first, always supportive, always trying to work with people, right? Again, this is an unprecedented time, and I think we've all got to display that patience and understanding and supportive approach, and be maybe not capital A accommodating, because that is when it relates to a human rights issue, but certainly small a accommodating, lowercase a accommodating where we can be. So work on approaches like that, but I'd you know, deal with that kind of issue the way you would any other kinds of requirements that you have to you know, you have to approach when it comes to dealing with third-party contractors. Like, for example, if you're going to maybe, you know, clean a particular work site, that might require you to ensure that your employees that deal with that work site are bonded or have certain level of security clearance, depending upon the privileged contents in that work site. So approaching it in those kinds of ways as another sort of occupational requirement that you have to deal with.
Okay, and we have a couple questions that, or somebody that echoed a question that was already asked about facilities that currently do not offer testing for unvaccinated healthcare workers. Even though it is part of the public health order, the question was, are they meeting undue hardship? So perhaps if you can expand on the concept of undue hardship.
Oh, sorry. Could you repeat that question, Carly?
Okay, I will repeat it
Yeah.
as it was posed, and hopefully we're both interpreting it the right way. What about facilities that do not offer testing for unvaccinated healthcare workers, despite it being part of the public health order? Are they meeting undue hardship?
So undue hardship comes into play where you have an obligation to provide reasonable accommodation up until that point of undue hardship. So I'm not sure of what those facilities are or their reason for not administering the testing, but if it was related to an issue of excessive cost, or, you know, some other significant sort of operational concern, it possibly could rise to the level of being an you know, an undue hardship. I think there's other you know, approaches being considered for facilitating that regular and periodic testing, but perhaps it could. The one thing I'd say though is you're only really dealing with that concept of undue hardship in scenarios where you're reasonably accommodating a human rights related need. So if, for example, an individual, you know, this is just about personal choice or preference not to be vaccinated, you're not really talking about reasonable accommodation or a legal obligation to provide that accommodation to that point of undue hardship.
Great, thank you. Does an employer are they required to have a written policy related to COVID-19 vaccination? And if so, if an employee requests a copy of the policy, is the employer obligated to provide that?
Yeah, so I can't say that there's a requirement, like a legal requirement that you have a written policy, but I certainly would strongly encourage that where this is being implemented as an occupational requirement, that you have it be in writing, that you have the basis for the requirement be really clear, that your policy gives due consideration to each of those principles that was listed earlier. So equitable access, evidence-based, time-limited, proportional, necessary, and privacy. So, you know, consideration be given in the policy to each of those issues. In particular, the time issue, right? That you make it really clear the time, you know, frame that this will be in place, and that it will be reviewed and that it may be renewed based on the attendant COVID-19 risks. So certainly I would strongly suggest that, because I think that it's really important that employees who may be subject to a policy understand subject to a requirement, understand the framework of that policy, and can see, through its written form, whether and how it corresponds to COVID or to human rights principles. And I should say, Carly, I could probably take another couple questions, and then I do have to jump onto another call. Apologies for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the time that you've been able to give us. It's, as you say, a hot topic, and so many folks have many questions. This is a bit more specific, but could be more widely applicable. Are there human rights considerations in the situation of an adult with a disability declining to be vaccinated based on misinformation provided to them by their caregiver?
Ooh, that is a really tricky scenario. It's possible that there could be human rights considerations in that scenario, but I'd say, and this is just a really practical response, that if that does arise, every effort should be made to support that adult in having sort of being able to live and make decisions with respect to the care that they receive in an informed way. So working with them around supportive decision making, trying to maybe figure out how information can be provided in a manner that's accessible and meaningful to allow for choice and decision making. But for sure, issues around supported decision making are, as it relates to persons with disabilities, are absolutely human rights issues, and we all have obligations to provide reasonable accommodation in those scenarios to support supported decision making and people exercising their legal capacity.
Thanks. And maybe the last one to wrap up on, what work has the Human Rights Commission been able to do in measuring structural inequity regarding access to COVID vaccines? And if this is not the role of the Human Rights Commission, do you have any suggestions for other organizations that have been doing good work on that front?
Yeah, so I, on behalf of, or as in my role as ED with the Commission, I participate on the Race, Ethnicity, and Indigenous Identifiers Steering Committee. And we have been looking certainly at the issue of access, and then the attendant impacts for, in particular, BIPOC communities when it comes to the rate of acquiring COVID, and then the impact of COVID within communities. So that for sure is something that we've been participating in through those established networks. But I know that work is going on through other organizations as well, and some of our public health experts like Dr. Marcia Anderson and others are probably well placed to comment on the examination of those impacts. But I think also, fairly well established public health research that looks at the barriers that structurally disadvantaged communities experience in accessing the healthcare system. Likely much of that research is transferable to this context as well, right? So we know that in particular, racialized communities experience barriers in gaining equitable access to healthcare. We know that people who use drugs and substances, people who experience homelessness and poverty, all of those are also situations that place people at greater risk for experiencing inequities in the healthcare system. And many of those learnings are transferable in this case as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen, for being able to stay with us and answer all those questions so comprehensively. There's lots of comments in the chat about how informative the presentation was, and with a lot of empathy, because it's a difficult topic. We recognize that. So thank you all for the thoughtful questions that everybody has put out there and that we've been able to discuss today. One of the things, as mentioned in the presentation, we'll circulate the slides that Karen provided along with some resources from the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. One of the things I will also share is OHC's website has a lot of information on COVID-19, about vaccinations. If you poke around our website, we have tons of information here. And of course, any future events we'll be posting on our website as well as circulating by email. So please do take a look there. It's ohcmb.ca. And yeah, thank you again so much, Karen. Tiffany, did you have anything that we need to wrap up with housekeeping wise?
No, thank you so much, Karen, and the team for having us for this session. We appreciate, all your patience, for all the technical issues we have, and then staying also beyond the scheduled time with us. So the session is recording already, so I will send you the session with the slide and all the resources to you later this week. So hopefully you all have a great week and take good care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.